Hello wrestling fans. Your favorite wrestling artificial intelligence robot is back with another back issue of The Observer. Let's get to it. September 1, 1992 Observer Newsletter, Patterson back in WWE. Jarrett and McMahon together. Japanese trip. By Observer staff. Wrestling Observer Newsletter, P.O. Box 1228, Campbell, California 950091228. September 1, 1992. Before starting out, I hope all of you reading this in the Southeast and your families came out of the recent hurricane without much in the way of long-term damage and have been able to get back to a normal environment by the time you read this. After being gone for the past few weeks, we've got a lot of catching up on news to do. I spent the past 2 weeks in Japan, viewing 13 wrestling shows in 14 days, so I'm not nearly as up to date as I should be about either US or Mexico news. However, there have been a number of major stories that have broken since the last Observer was published 3 weeks ago. Next week's Observer will be a double issue to catch up on all the news in August, plus coverage of SummerSlam and in-depth coverage of the Japanese wrestling scene. Pat Patterson returning to the WWF. Pat Patterson, Pierre Claremont, Vince McMahon's longtime right-hand man when it came to booking, wrestling personnel and angles in the WWF, who officially resigned amidst the WWF sex scandal 6 months ago, will be returning to Titan to work in the same capacity according to several sources. Patterson's return is expected to be announced to the wrestlers within the next few weeks. The wrestlers were given strong hints of Patterson's imminent return at the last television tapings when attorneys were present asking various wrestlers if they had any objections to Patterson's return. While I don't know this as a fact, one would suspect that wrestlers being asked that question would respond negatively since, if this was being done, the decision really was already made, and unless someone was a really big star, to say something other than "you've never had a problem and have no problem with his return" could be viewed by some as professional suicide. WWF house show attendance this past summer, without Patterson's official input, although an awful lot of people believe Patterson was never out of touch and that his input was there all along, was down 35 to 40%, and television ratings and overall interest in the product also hit new all-time low. Patterson, 52, was one of the all-time great workers in the business before retiring to a front office position with Titan Sports. However, in February he and his assistant Terry Joyelle, resigned after news stories broke, which didn't name him by name until after his resignation, alleging an impending civil suit for sexual misconduct and violation of child labor laws by Titan Sports officials. Mel Phillips, the head of the ring crew and longtime ring announcer, was also let go amidst the news stories. Tom Cole, who made the original complaint, settled his grievance before filing suit, and the settlement included being hired back by the WWF in a contracted settlement in which Titan agreed to the fact that Phillips and Garvin would never work for the company again. Patterson's name was never part of the settlement. Patterson was mentioned by many during that time period and since, in particular publicly by Eric Tovey, former midget wrestler and Booker Lord Littlebrook, Murray Hodgson, a former WWF television announcer, Tom Hankins, an independent wrestler who asked Patterson for work as a job, Paul Roma, former WWF wrestler, and Barry Orton, former WWF wrestler, as having used his position as the number 2 power on the wrestling side in ways that they perceived as sexual harassment. There is the defense that some people will perceive things in a certain way, particularly in a homophobic world which pro wrestling can sometimes be, and that the position of booker leads to resentment. There is also the defense that Patterson's lifestyle was hardly unknown and he was known to joke about it and was something of a practical joker anyway. Perhaps someone took seriously what was meant in humor and misconstrued it. Perhaps. But having said all that, there are an awful lot of questions that have been left unanswered. Quite frankly, years back situations apparently similar to this were mentioned often by WWF broadcasters on telecasts as inside jokes with references to certain younger wrestlers as being graduates of the Pat Patterson and Terry Garvin School of Self-Defense, with not-so-veiled comments thrown in about they're behind him all the way and they're teaching him to go behind. Hodgson was the only person to take any legal action on a claim that in any way indirectly involved Patterson. Titan is apparently satisfied that Hodgson's case is no longer any kind of a threat, so there are no legal claims involving Patterson, and the Hodgson suit actually didn't mention him by name, I don't believe. From a PR standpoint, the WWF obviously feels that this, as a news story, is a dead issue, or it could have easily used Patterson in a secret capacity and not have contacted the wrestlers at the last taping and made it obvious Patterson was returning in a power position. My own feeling on all this is, simply, if Patterson never did anything wrong, he never should have resigned, and Vince McMahon should have never accepted his resignation. McMahon always maintained Patterson's innocence in every case. Whether or not these stories are true or that Patterson was an innocent victim of circumstances, I can't tell you with any certainty, but I do believe strongly McMahon does know with certainty and has all along. The political situation in Mexico City heats up. The promotional war between the upstart AAA promotion and the established EMLL and UWA groups came to a major explosion this past few weeks. Manny Guzman, the head of the SNL, the Wrestlers and Referees Union in Mexico City, which included all major wrestlers in the Mexico City area until recently when the AAA wrestlers formed their own union. SNL officially stripped all AAA wrestlers, who joined the new union, of their union membership last Wednesday, and SNL called for a strike, although a boycott would be the most appropriate term, of all promoters and arenas that use non-union wrestlers, or in other words, promote shows with AAA wrestlers on that. I believe that two smaller arenas in Mexico City that had been running AAA shows on a weekly basis canceled cards over this past weekend, knuckling under because it would mean that not only would neither of the established groups be allowed to work in the arenas, but no union wrestlers would work independently promoted shows in those buildings as well. Jarrett and McMahon form a working relationship, while no financial considerations have been able to ascertain. Jerry Jarrett, head of the Tennessee-based United States Wrestling Association, has reached a working agreement with the WWF. The basic agreement is that the USWO will become a feeder system for the WWF, where the WWF will send green wrestlers to gain experience and test out gimmicks before bringing them national. For years there has been talk of McMahon setting up his own feeder circuit, although most of the talk centered on that being done somewhere in Western Canada, either based out of Calgary or in British Columbia. McMahon and Bruce Hart had over the years had many talks about such a venture, and many years back the old Stampede Wrestling promotion in a limited way did use some wrestlers the WWF was grooming to give them experience, but the reality was that it turned out to benefit neither side because the wrestlers McMahon sent out, House Jack comes to mind, were so bad it hurt Stampede to use them and have to push that. And even though they gained experience, they were still so bad when they got to Titan that Titan really didn't benefit either. In return, Jarrett will be involved in helping promote WWF shows that come into his major cities, and some of the USWA talent will appear on those shows as well. This was also the same situation used in Calgary, which, the way it was done then, established the local wrestlers as being subpar to the touring wrestlers because they worked underneath on the major shows. McMahon will send green wrestlers and stale talent to work Tennessee, and also on occasion send mid-level wrestlers for one-shot deals to Memphis on Monday nights, which should help the local office because they'll be able to book what will be perceived by the fans as inter-promotion matchups, which should help the local gate. From what I understand, WWF wrestlers will be appearing on the Memphis television show as early as this coming weekend. While nobody has told me this officially, it would make sense to use Jimmy Hart, who was the best manager in the business for years while working the Tennessee territory and was a huge part of the enormous success that company had during the early 1980s feuding with Jerry Lawler. Hart, as a manager, could restart his feud with Lawler and bring in green talent the WWF wants to develop, such as a JW Storm, to work a program with Lawler, and Hart wouldn't have to even appear at the house shows, just simply send in videos each week, and on occasion he could send in one of the established WWF heels if the WWF isn't running on a Monday or that heel isn't involved in a program at that specific time. The first angle involving all this actually took place several weeks ago when Jeff Jarrett appeared on Memphis television and said he was going to the WWF show that was in the city and would challenge one of the WWF wrestlers. Jarrett sat in a second row seat and hopped the barricade and challenged Bret Hart for the Intercontinental title in a match that will take place on a WWF show in Tennessee in late October. A similar situation occurred when the WWF taped television a few days later, where Jarrett again challenged Hart, which will probably air in USWA cities, but not nationally. SummerSlam this week. While I don't have a lot of details, overall WWF house business during August apparently dropped to even lower levels than in July. Cable TV ratings have shown a slight increase, although traditionally August is one of the stronger months for cable, and they are still way down in ratings as compared with 1 year ago. The WWF SummerSlam preview special, which aired on both August 23rd and August 24th of the USA Network, drew 2.7 and 2.3 ratings respectively, both ratings by far the lowest for any WWF pay-per-view preview special, down a full 23% from the SummerSlam preview special in 1991 and 32% from the 1990 SS preview. The highlights of the show, taped on August 11th in Nashville, was a tag team match with Nasty Boys vs. Randy Savage and Ultimate Warrior, who is now wearing a bodysuit with his muscularity drawn in order for him to keep his muscleman gimmick and, I suppose, stay off the juice at the same time, since more than one WWF wrestler said they believed he was being exempted from the same rules as everyone else. Ric Flair and Mr. Perfect came out and attacked Warrior and got him away from the ring, leaving 2-on-1 on Savage, who lost via countout. Savage made his own comeback on Nasty Boys, but Savage and Warrior also argued throughout the match. Flair beat Tito Santana in 15-20 with the figure 4 in a match many people have raved about. Nevertheless, those I've spoken with are legitimately optimistic that SS can do a buy rate on the same level as the last WrestleMania, mid to low twos, because of the belief that a lot of interest and curiosity has been stirred up over which corner Mr. Perfect will be in during the Ultimate Warrior vs. Randy Savage main event for the WWF title. The show takes place August 29th in London and airs on pay-per-view on August 31st here in the United States. And a Clash, the 20th anniversary of Pro Wrestling on TBS Clash of Champions special takes place on September 2nd at Center Stage. With this lineup, Ron Simmons defends the WCW title against Cactus Jack, Jake Roberts and Rick Rude, and Super Invader and Big Van Vader versus Sting and Nikita Koloff and Steiner Brothers in an elimination tag team match. Steve Austin versus Rick Steamboat for the TV title with Paulie dangerously suspended in a cage above the ring. Brad Armstrong versus Brian Pillman for the WCW light heavyweight title. Barry Windham and Dustin Rhodes versus The Barbarian and Dan Spivey, Arnold Anderson, and Bobby Eaton. Now managed by Michael Hayes, with the story being that Arn and Bobby are going after the titles held by Steve Williams and Terry Gordy, and that nobody knows Terry Gordy better than Michael Hayes, versus Dick Slater and Greg Valentine with Larry Zbyszko in their corner, Johnny B. Bad versus Scotty Flamingo, and Van Hammer versus Dallas Pay. Plus they will air clips of the NWA tournament from Japan and have guest appearances by Freddie Miller, Gordon Solis announcing co-host of Georgia Championship Wrestling during the late 70s and early 80s, and a few former Georgia wrestlers including Tim Woods, who was the territory's top babyface in the late 1960s and early 1970s as Mr. Wrestler. Don't forget, we'll be doing our readers poll for both the pay-per-view and Clash. You can fax in your thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs in the middle, best match, worst match, and comments on the show at 408-378-6562 afternoon Eastern Time any day after either show, 9 a.m. Pacific Time, or you can write us with your comments, or you can leave a phone message with your comments 24 hours a day at 408-379-8067. WCW houses up, but TV ratings remain low, a combination of several things, most notably a gimmick pricing situation that allows 2 children free for each paying adult ticket, has resulted in a huge increase in attendance, although 30 to 40% of those in the building are getting in for, which of course would be expected with that gimmick, but also significantly increased houses. Well, the biggest houses, Jacksonville at $37,000 on August 15th, Atlanta at $35,000 on August 16th, and Little Rock at $32,000 on August 19th, are not that different from what some of the better house earlier in the year did. This past week's houses averaged $23,600, and 3,480 fans in the building in cities in Louisiana and Arkansas that haven't drawn numbers like that in year. Crowd enthusiasm at the house shows was high as well. Traditionally, following up on the heavily gimmicked houses usually results in a decrease, and several WWF sources have insisted these gains are a result of short-term pricing gimmickry that in the long run will hurt both offices because it cheapens the value of a wrestling ticket in the fan's eye. Many are also crediting the increases to the Angles run on August 2nd in Baltimore, Ron Simmons becoming WCW champion, and the debut of Jake Roberts since the first week after the title switch with the gimmick prices but before the change in angle were known to the general audience, drew poorly in the Midwest. Roberts has been getting a huge babyface reaction, surprisingly, at all house shows except when he's matched against Sting. Simmons has been praised for his match quality in his title matches against Big Van Vader, and he's getting a huge reaction everywhere since taking the strap. However, the 2 main WCW cable shows over the past few weeks averaged a 2.1 rating, poor numbers for the month of August, which shows the new angles, at least to this point, haven't increased general public interest in the product. However, morale may have sunk even lower. Mike Mooningham's column in the August 2nd Charleston, South Carolina, Post-Courier detailed the morale problems with Bill Watts that had been reported here previously. The column stated, several WCW performers, speaking on condition of anonymity, say morale has reached a new low. Morale is the worst I've ever seen, said one high-profile WCW personality. Nobody is being paranoid, but everybody knows this guy, Watts, is not going to pay. We've come to this after so many years of on-air talent and wrestling personalities considered nothing more than a wrestler with that great mystique of having a broken-down body living in a trailer talking about the good old days. We finally progressed without unions, without representation, without holdouts, but through professionalism. Finally, Turner Broadcasting has brought respect to its on-air personalities. And we've progressed from being wrestlers to being on-air personalities, in essence, performers, sports entertainers. One source said he foresees many of the company's top stars fleeing to the WWF once their contracts are up. Watts has made it clear that the big buck guaranteed contracts that have been doled out in recent years will be replaced by unguaranteed, incentive-based contracts. Vince McMahon doesn't guarantee money, but he treats his talent fairly and with respect, said a source. While some people don't appreciate all the gimmicks in his organization, he does treat his wrestlers like a businessman. Watts wants everyone to go back to the old format. One reason why nobody pushed for unions is that things were progressing at a low but sure pace. But now all that's being thrown out the window. These guys have families, said the source, and one of the reasons they're here is because of guaranteed money. Terry Taylor has a family. He was making $3,000 a week. He's spending 30% of that on taxes, and out of the rest, he's spending $75,000 a year on the road. He's not staying in suites with jacuzzis. That's $75,000 in business expenses to live on the road. And Watts takes him off contract. In the meantime, he can't take independent dates either because he's afraid he'll have a WCW booking and have to cancel at the last minute, or he'll get fired for accepting independent dates. Editor's note: since this article was printed, Taylor was let go and not offered the $300 per night to work an unspecified schedule. Watts is going to have to hope that the Slaters, Barbarians, Williams and Gordys will do the jobs because the Stings, Steiners, Terry Taylors, Rude and Austins will not stay around under these conditions. Watts was furious about the article and mentioned it during a meeting on August 16 with the wrestlers before a television taping at the Omni in Atlanta. Watts asked if anyone had a problem and told them he wanted to know if anyone had a morale problem. Surprisingly, one wrestler, Nikita Koloff, spoke up and talked about having a problem with the rule about having to stay in the buildings until the main event ends every night. Ironically, the person speaking up here, Koloff, at this point is still high on the cards and thus would be in the buildings late every night anyway, unlike a prelim wrestler who is affected by this rule and missing occasional chances to catch a late flight home and spend an extra night every now and then with his family, which, because of the travel schedule, family time is limited. Watts responded, and since I only heard this from one source and don't want to misquote him, but suffice to say every wrestler with a family, which is most of the guys, were left cold with something along the lines of this business isn't conducive to family life. Talent movement: the rumor mill has been spinning at an unheard of pace these past few weeks, with the vast majority having little or no truth whatsoever. Any talk about a trade of talent between WWF and WCW is ludicrous because all the wrestlers involved would have to approve it and it would open both companies up to huge antitrust lawsuits. WWF cannot assign a wrestler to WCW and vice versa and negate a valid contract with the existing organization or have the new organization pick up the new contract. It's clear monopolistic tactics that would never hold up in court. If a wrestler's contract expires, the other organization can legally sign him up if it wants to and doesn't have to make a deal to give anything in return. WWF is said to be making an unofficial play for Sting, figuring that he must be unhappy because he's been removed from the title picture. However, Sting's guaranteed money contract is the most lucrative of any wrestler in North America, at a reported $700,000 per year, not including substantial merchandising income thrown in, and doesn't expire until early 1995. And while nothing is impossible, I'd literally be shocked at him walking away from that kind of a deal unless WCW decides it wants him to quit and makes an attempt to make his life miserable, which hasn't been the case. Apparently Ted DiBiase has talked with WCW and I don't know his current contract situation. I don't believe Bret Hart has talked with WCW, but his contract, if it hasn't been renewed over the past few weeks, was set to be open for a negotiation period starting in a few days. Ric Flair is going nowhere. That's as close to a certainty as anything in this business. Much of these rumors have actually been started by WCW by people's overreactions to remarks made by Jim Ross on his 900 number. What happened is that several weeks ago when Ross mentioned he'd have the latest on Hulk Hogan, it created a huge groundswell of calls to the 900 number, which created the situation where he talked about wrestlers from other companies, Hart, DiBiase and Flair in particular, and tried to insinuate they might be coming to WCW as a way to take the 900 number calls. The Steiners' contract runs out at the end of this year, and Pro Wrestling Torch reported them being offered $1,000 per match each, which would basically be a cut from the $300,000 plus deal they are currently contracted to. So they'll have a decision to make. Even at $1,000 per match with a pay cut, if they get 250 dates, it's still probably more money than they would make with either the WWF or New Japan, which wants to continue using them, but feels they are more effective as draws in their current role of making only a few appearances per year rather than as regular. If they are booked on 180 dates, well, they likely could make more money with the WWF. Paul E. Dangerously's contract runs out in April of 1994, however it's quite obvious Watts wants him out of the picture by what has been said and the way he's been phased out. There has been an awful lot of talk that Arnold Anderson and Bobby Eaton will both be fired in January when their contracts, $260,000 and about $170,000 respectively, expire, although in a major surprise, on the TBS television show that airs on September 5, They were put over the Steiners when Rick was pinned after Bobby gave him the Alabama Jam, and they've gotten a renewed push in a three-way feud with Steiners and Steve Williams and Terry Gordy. In order to phase out Dangerously, it'd either have to get Dangerously to somehow breach his contract or get him to quit, because if he's fired, the contract still has to be paid off. My feeling here is that Dangerously is in the exact same position Jim Cornette was in with Jim Herd. When Herd took over in 1989, he saw all these existing contracts and saw Cornette at $225,000 per year and thought that no manager deserves that kind of money, so he wanted to face him down to prove that he wasn't worth that kind of money, and it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. When Watts took over in May, he no doubt saw Dangerously's newly signed 2-year deal, which probably was in excess of $200,000 per year, and no doubt had the same reaction, that no manager is worth that kind of money, and when the person in charge believes it, his decisions will make sure that's the case, particularly since Watts is trying to cut personnel expenses as a way to improve the bottom line, and Dangerously is hardly alone in this vein. Both Bam Bam Bigelow and Big Van Vader, who have been the top foreign draws for New Japan for the past several years, are both on their way out. Bigelow's contract expires after the January 4th Tokyo Dome show, and he's expecting to head to WWF as a heel at that point. Vader will be going to New Japan in October for the tag team tournament after missing most of September because he's getting his knee operated on. After that point, he's expecting to go full-time with WCW. New Japan is looking at several big Americans. Names that have been mentioned include Warlord, Hercules, Ron Powers, Jim Neidhart, who is now a regular at $5,000 per week, and Night Stalker, to fill the void with the belief, as was the case with Vader and with Scott Norton, but not with Tony Holm, that they can take a huge wrestler with limited ability and their workers are good enough to make him a superstar. Of course, Vader improved tremendously over the years to where he became a damn good worker, while Norton also improved his work and got over huge, whereas Holme was pushed just as much and isn't over at all because fans see through his lack of ability. Terry Taylor was turned down by the WWF and is going to New Japan in October for the tag team tournament. There has been talk with him and Smoky Mountain as well, although I don't know that money figures have been agreed upon in either case. There are negotiations going on to bring Terry Funk to FMW for a match with the Sheik, who at last word was hospitalized in really rough condition, on September 19th at Yokohama Baseball Stadium underneath the Atsushi Onita vs. Tiger Jeet Singh explosive barbed wire match. I don't believe it's a done deal, however. Mexico's Conan El Barbaro was fired by the WWF basically before he even started, as those in power must have had a change of heart about his lucha libre style fitting in, or simply because the agreed upon working agreement and alliance between WWF and AAA may have drowned before it could swim. The whole gimmick was going to be scrapped until Paul Diamond made a remark about being able to fit into the robot costume, and next thing you know, Vince McMahon heard the remark and decided to go for it, so at the last tapings, Diamond worked as Relampago in the robot suit. This could be an interesting legal case because the gimmick was originally Conan's idea, not McMahon's, although it was McMahon who paid for the gimmick costume. Kensuke Sasaki of New Japan expressed interest in coming to WCW later this year, and Dusty Rhodes and Bill Watts expressed interest in bringing Chris Benoit after seeing his match with Jushin Liger on August 12. All Japan Women is working on some mixed promotional matches, as Bull Nakano and Akira Hokuto will be headed to the FMW September 19 stadium show to work with FMW women Yukari Maeda Mori and Erika Tsuchiya. The FMW women in return will probably work All Japan Women dates later in the year, and there's even beginnings of talk of using a few JWP women on All Japan Women shows in 1993. Hogan and New Japan, the deal has yet to be signed. However, the New Japan office has talked about either a Hogan vs. Scott Norton or Hogan vs. Antonio Inoki main event for the January 4th, 93 card at the Tokyo Egg Dome, so they must feel somewhat confident a deal will be finalized shortly. The story in Japan was that the price per match, $100,000, was agreed upon. However, Hogan wanted to guarantee 4 matches per year at $100,000 for 2 years plus retain all his merchandising rights in Japan. New Japan only wanted to book Hogan twice per year for 2 years, since they are selling out all their big shows without him anyway, which would probably buy a January card at the Tokyo Dome and a spring show at the new Fukuoka Indoor Dome Stadium that holds 68,000 each year. I believe New Japan was willing to go up to $150,000, but wanted to retain the merchandising rights. 3 world title changes in Japan these past 2 weeks in the ring may have been the biggest in the long history of Japanese wrestling, with probably 7 different shows drawing in excess of $550,000 houses and 3 world titles changing hands. For a comparison, in the history of pro wrestling in the US, there have been only 5 live gates in excess of $550,000. Certainly there has never been more in the way of as many major shows in such a short time period in the Tokyo area alone ever. As most of you I'm sure know already, Masahiro Chono captured the revived NWA World Heavyweight title, winning the 15-man tournament, beating Rick Rude in the finals on August 12 at Tokyo Sumo Palace in 29:44 with a flying shoulder block off the top rope. On August 16 at the Fukuoka International Center, Keiji Muto, who originally was going to be the choice to win the NWA tournament but the decision was changed, wrestling as the Great Muta won the IWGP World Heavyweight title and Greatest 18 Club World Martial Arts title, pinning Riki Choshu with a moonsault in 11:26. Muta worked as a total heel, making Choshu juice by hitting him with a beer bottle and even spraying him with a fire extinguisher. However, after the match, Muta said that he would never wrestle as Great Muta in Japan again and would strictly be Keiji Muto. With all that news going in New Japan, All Japan needed to create a headline of its own, and thus, Mitsuharu Masao won the Triple Crown from Stan Hansen at Budokan Hall in Tokyo on August 22, gaining a surprise pinfall in 24:03 with a forearm smash. Also in Japan, Lou Thesz appeared at a UWFI press conference and announced that he was presenting his original NWA title belt, which he said represented the last undisputed World Heavyweight Champion, to UWFI World Martial Arts Champion Gary Albright, and issued a challenge for Chon, his one-time protege, or any other world title claimant, to create one real world champion. Title changes in other groups. Among the title changes in the smaller promotions over the past few weeks, Dirty White Boy Tony Anthony captured the Smoky Mountain title on August 8 in Johnson City, Tennessee on a spectacular entitled Fire on the Mountain, which got major rave reviews, plus the fantastic Bobby and Jackie Fulton won the SMW Tag Team titles, beating the Heavenly Bodies in a barbed wire cage match the same night, in which 3 different correspondents all rated as 5 stars. Rod Price is now GWF North American Champion since Scott Putski, the previous champ, was fired on August 14. Price was awarded the title at the August 21 show in Dallas when Putski failed to appear. The Blackbirds, King Parsons and Action Jackson, won the GWF Tag Team titles on August 7, beating the Ebony Experience. Invader No. 1 Jose Gonzalez won the WWC Universal title, pinning Carlitos Colon on August 8 in Bayamon, Puerto Rico. The Moondogs regained the USWA Tag Team titles from Jerry Lawler and Jeff Jarrett, and Reno Riggins won the Southern title from Brian Christopher, both on the August 10 card in Memphis. Christopher had won the Southern title on the August 3 card in Memphis from Pritchard. While this isn't confirmed, I'm pretty much certain Lawler and Jarrett regained the tag titles on the August 17 show in Memphis, since Lawler put his hair at stake. Chuel Guerrero won the UWA World Junior Heavyweight title on August 7 in Netzahualcoyot, Mexico from Viano Trace, winning the third fall via DQ. Titles change hands in Mexico and Japan via DQ. Bulldog KT, Hide Takayama and Pat Tanaka won the UWA Intercontinental Tag Team titles in a tournament on August 16 in Tokyo at Korakuen Hall, beating Kendo and Cooley SC, Shoji Akiyoshi, in the finals. No lucha on horizon after local promoters in Los Angeles put together the largest grossing independent show in U.S. wrestling history on July 4 in conjunction with AAA. The major lucha scene appears to be dormant in Southern California, with the exception of the weekly club show. Local promoters Rudy Rojas and Edgar Fuardo had opened the lines of communication as far as dealing with either EMLL or UWA, but both groups are wrapped up in their own promotional war in Mexico City and aren't interested in running shows in the U.S. at this point in time. Radio musical chairs, John Arezzi took over for Mike Tenay on the Wrestling Insider's weekly Saturday night talk show on the Sports and Entertainment Network. Tenay quit the show because he was frustrated with station management and is attempting to put together his own syndicated radio talk show package. An interesting twist is that Arezzi wanted to use the Pro Wrestling Spotlight name, which he's used for years on his New York radio show and on his wrestling newsletter, but the station management insisted on using the Insider's name, which Tenay came up with himself. Tenay's attorneys sent a cease and desist letter in regards to the name early this week. Confirmation of WBF steroid report, the new issue of Muscle Mag International, in what was actually a favorable story about drug testing and steroid use in both WCW and WWF, confirmed what was reported here several weeks ago and originally reported in the Muscle Beach newsletter. The 10 of the 13 WBF bodybuilder, including eventual contest winner Gary Stridham, failed their steroid tests 6 weeks prior to the drug-free WBF championships in June. If you realize McMahon had complete knowledge of this, and still promoted and announced the shows in a way that insisted to the audience that these bodybuilders were all drug-free, probably says more about his true character than anything in Penthouse magazine. The story praised the WWF/WBF drug testing program, no doubt partially because it is headed by Dr. Mauro Di Pasquale, who also writes for the same magazine, and put Di Pasquale over by saying how he suspended the bodybuilders without pay for 6 weeks when he caught them using steroids in his test. Ironically, the fact that the bodybuilders were all heavily promoted on television and in local radio advertising in Southern California as being drug-free when the company doing the advertising knew full well they weren't, seemed a lost contradiction to the same magazine. July business comparisons. The following is a comparison between the state of the wrestling industry in July of 1992 as compared with July 1991 in the four major wrestling offices: WWF, WCW, All Japan and New Japan. All attendances and gate figures averages are rough estimates, and I'd suspect all figures listed here as being slightly higher than the real numbers because we are more likely to get reports on shows that do big business as opposed to those that stiff. However, in showing the overall trend, tracking and comparing these figures should be quite accurate. The trends from the past few months continued in July. While WWF attendance as compared to the previous July was down nearly 40%, some of that can be tempered by the fact that the WWF was playing some smaller market shows as compared with the previous year. In fact, the overall trend seems to be up slightly from last month, even though live attendance is at almost exactly the same point it has been in since the decline started after WrestleMania. But the television ratings are inching up during a time of year when they generally will show no movement. They are still well below last year's level, but have improved from the previous month, ending a consistently downward trend that also started in April. Estimated wrestling-generated income dropped over the past July from about $3.2 million to about $2.01 million. From the WCW perspective, as a month, July was a disaster. If you remember the state the company was in last year, that's saying something. July 1, 1991 was when Ric Flair was fired, making it the first time in NWA/WCW history that the NWA champion didn't lose his belt in the ring. During the first week of July, the early part of the much ballyhooed Great American Bash Tour, which was before fans at the arenas knew Flair wasn't going to appear at the shows, WCW averaged a whopping 3,490 paid attendance per event, a figure perilously close to the WWF's current average. For the remainder of the month in what turned into a disastrous Bash Tour, the average was decimated, down to a scant 1,305. Because of the high first week, the overall average for the month was slightly above this year's average attendance. When you throw in the lower ticket prices of 1992, you have average gates dropping a substantial 28.6% from 1991, and that's with running fewer shows in the middle of the week that traditionally hurts the average. However, in comparison with June, there has been an increase in attendance and average gate, so again, the overall trend seems to be that business bottomed out in May and June and slowly started to rebound in July. Television ratings aren't quite as low as June, when they bottomed out, but are still struggling. Where the word disaster comes in is the Great American Bash pay-per-view show. While the 1991 Bash is long remembered as being one of the worst shows of all time, it's the 1992 Bash that hit the skids as far as viewer apathy. The buy rate was cut more than half from last year, much of which can be attributed to having so many pay-per-view shows in such a short period of time. But much of the blame also has to be pointed at the company itself for doing such a poor job of promoting the show, including nearly ignoring the show on television the weekend before the event in order to promote an omni show instead. Even with the increase in the overall pay-per-view universe leading up to the Olympics, overall revenue was nearly cut in half. Given that WCW ran more live events last year as well, company wrestling event produced revenue for July dropped a staggering 47.6%, from an estimated $1,972,560 down to an estimated $1,033,880. Although expenses from a more expensive travel and arena schedule certainly were higher last year as well, the overall trend here doesn't look bad, but, from a financial point of view, the month of July was a disaster. While All Japan decreased in attendance, that mainly came from playing smaller-sized arenas, since they sold out nearly 90% of their shows. The loss of top-drawing card jumbo Tsuruta for the entire month probably had no bearing on the decrease since most of the shows did capacity business. Combining that with increases in television ratings even with Tsuruta out of action shows, the overall picture looks good. New Japan also declined slightly at the gate in comparison with last year, but as the increase in sellout percentage shows, again, much of that can be attributed to playing smaller buildings. New Japan also had high ticket prices at a few of the shows during July, which accounted for an increase in average gate. At the same time, there was a decrease in attendance. While television ratings were down enough from June to where it is relevant, the ratings are still way ahead of the same period in 1991. Japan Trip 5. Schedule. August 10th, Tokyo Sumo Palace, New Japan NWA Tournament. August 11th, Tokyo Sumo Palace, New Japan NWA Tournament. August 12th, Tokyo Sumo Palace, New Japan NWA Tournament. August 13th, Tokyo Korakuen Hall WAR. August 14th, Tokyo Korakuen Hall, WING. August 15th, Noon Show, Tokyo Korakuen Hall, All Japan Women. August 15th, Evening Show, Tokyo Korakuen Hall, Universal. August 16th, Tokyo Korakuen Hall, Universal. August 17th, Live Network Television Special from 1:30 to 5 a.m., Tokyo TV Asahi Studios, JWP. August 20th, Tokyo Korakuen Hall, All Japan. August 21st, Yokohama Arena, Rings. August 22nd, Tokyo Budokan Hall, All Japan. August 23rd, Higashiyamato, All Japan Women. Best match, Manami Toyota vs Toshio Yamada in a hair versus hair match on the August 15th All Japan Women's show. If the match itself wasn't good enough, and it was the post-match scenario where Yamada got her hair shaved, put it over the edge, Yamada should also get a nod for best individual performance, working a 20-minute tag team match that was 4 stars and coming back 5 minutes later for a 20-minute singles match that was easily 5 stars. After Yamada was pinned to lose the match and the barber came in, Toyota suddenly had a change of heart and didn't want her regular tag partner to get her head shaved. She begged the ref to allow Yamada to not have her head shaved. When the barber got the scissors and started on Yamada's hair, Toyota grabbed the scissors away and started cutting her own hair. She kept jumping to keep the barber, who nearly ruined this scenario by not selling it right, from cutting Yamada's hair until she was held back and started crying. She watched their haircut while the women in the audience, which only made up 10% of the crowd, more on that later, cried with it. I've seen more emotional scenes in wrestling and things that give you more goosebumps, but this was still a super performance all the way around. Best card match quality. In terms of match quality and excitement, the August 15th All Japan Women's show gets the nod. Even with several of its best wrestlers missing because they were on tour elsewhere or injured, the quality of the top 3 matches made it an even better show than any of the NWA tournament nights at Sumo Hall or the All Japan card at Budokan, which is no small accomplishment. Best card, crowd intensity, All Japan at Budokan Hall on August 22nd. I've seen better live cards both in the US and Japan as far as match quality, although it was an excellent show. But I've never seen a card where everything was over. You can remember certain things like Hulk Hogan appearing on a sold-out card in a big feud match, or Rock and Roll Express or Dusty Rhodes during their peaks as babyfaces getting the big reaction, but in this case, everyone from top to bottom on the show was over, even the referee, and that's no exaggeration, as the place went wild with chants for Ref Joe Higuchi before the Stan Hansen vs Mitsuharu Misawa main event. The crowd doesn't just chant the wrestlers' names like Misawa, Kawada, Kobashi, Baba, Tsuruta, etc. when they come out. They scream the names at the top of their lungs. And it isn't just the people you'd expect that get that kind of treatment. Even a prelim wrestler like Haruka Eigen has his name screamed in unison by 16,300 fans. Freaky. Best card overall production, Rings on August 21st at Yokohama Arena. Of all the cards I saw, the 2 that will stick in my memory the longest are this show and the August 17th JWP show, more on that below. Whatever one might think of things Akira Maeda has done in the past or said in the past, he has to be given credit for the fact he is one of the great self-promoters and wrestling promoters in general that this business has ever seen. He largely has taken a group of people who aren't even wrestlers and put them in something that he doesn't even want to be associated with pro wrestling, and has turned it into a high-class version of something that most definitely is pro wrestling. No, this would not work in this country. At least not without the same 5-year education process that Japan went through in the mid-1980s, largely due to Maeda's self-promotional abilities. But many of the concepts used as part of the show would give those in this country so many new ideas on things that can be done to make pro wrestling seem more of a higher class activity and more respectable. The souvenir lines were incredible. The beginning of the show with the laser light show, opening ceremony and promotional pre-show video showing everyone in dramatic form prior to the card. The pre-show video, for some reason, is done in English rather than Japanese to give it an international flavor, showing men training in Bulgaria, Gracie, formerly Soviet Union, Japan, Holland, etc. as the toughest gladiators from around the world being brought together to form rings, gave it an aura that probably couldn't be understood by anyone who didn't see it live. Another plus is that Yokohama Arena, which, unlike most arenas in Japan, is a state-of-the-art complex reminiscent of Madison Square Garden. Maeda didn't sell his summer spectacular out like he would have routinely during the peak of his drawing power with the UWF, but drawing 14,700 paid with ringside at $160 and elevated ringside at $120 with a troupe that consists of almost nobody who had ever wrestled professionally before, which actually works to his advantage because they are all fresh and untainted, so to speak, except himself says more for his ability as a promoter than anything. As for the matches, well, if you're in the building and feeling the atmosphere, they're okay. Some were actually embarrassing judged by pro wrestling standards, but it really doesn't matter because it's a different product and not supposed to look in the ring like pro wrestling. And it doesn't. Are the matches shoots like they've got their audience believing they are? How many times in boxing does somebody get knocked down 4 times and then immediately come back to win? In rings, that's the classic match story that gets the biggest pop for the finish. The martial arts guy knocks down the submission wrestler 4 times, 5 knockdowns is an automatic knockout and ends the match. And then the submission guy gets his big hold on in the middle and gets the submission. In many ways, Maeda's rings is both the farthest thing and the closest thing to the WWF. Worst show every way, shape and form, wrestling and romance, WAR, on August 13th at Korakuen Hall. Aside from the fact there was some exceedingly stiff work in a few of the matches, and the Genichiro Tenryu vs Masao Orihara match was a very compelling and gripping destruction match that made the Steiners vs Fujinami and Iizuka seem like a 3-year-old patty cake game, this was as bad as any wrestling card you would ever want us. The show was scheduled to start at 6:30 p.m. Tenryu came out at that point and did a 20-minute condo with the fans. Actually, in this case, my not knowing the language made it seem long and boring when, to those in the building, it really wasn't bad. What was next was bad. They had a bunch of prizes, and before the show they had fans pay for bingo cards. So everyone played bingo. I thought it was kind of funny, except bingo lasted until 7:50 p.m., lasting roughly 1 hour, before they gave away all the prizes, which consisted of things like cheap rubber balls and pieces of paper with Tenryu's autograph. This was as unbearable as watching the Bushwhackers have to work 3 20-minute matches in a row against the Raju brothers. You know what happened next? They went to intermission. Actually, by this point it was almost funny how horrible the show was, except that the 90 minutes had seemed like about 4 hours. Then they announced the next big card for September 15th at Yokohama Arena. They're going to have to give 100,000 tickets away to draw 15,000 there, and announced who would be on the card. First off, they announced the Road Warriors, Legion of Doom, which got only a polite response. Kind of surprising because despite how bad this show was, it was a fairly hardcore audience that exploded when Tenryu came out for his Konda. And Beverly Brothers to no response. When I say no response, I mean out of the 1,600 there, not one reacted. Then they announced the Berserker. Again, nobody reacted. The Undertaker. 5 girls in kimonos popped like crazy, 1,595 guys sat on their hands. Paul Bearer. 2 of the girls popped again. King Haku. Decent reaction, actually. Ultimo Dragon, Yoshihiro Asai. Only a fair reaction. No more than Haku, quite honestly. This was freaky since I've seen Asai tear the house down in the same building on numerous occasions. Negro Casas. Best reaction thus far, but still best described as lukewarm. When they announced Ultimate Warrior and Randy Savage, there was 0 reaction. At 8:10 the first match got in the ring with 2 rookies, one a roided-up powerlifting champion named Yoshiro Ito who may have been making his debut. The match was no doubt as bad as Bill Kazmaier's debut match probably was up in Calgary, or any of his matches, for that matter. Well, it at least made me realize how great a worker Ted Arcidi really was. It was -1 1/2 star, and that's being nice since both men were just starting out. Then came Tatsumi Kitahara versus Samson Fuyuki, and the first 7 minutes were terrible. In fairness, it got pretty good from there, and both guys worked for all they were worth to a 20-minute draw and were totally blown up by the end. Tenryu vs Orihara came next, and it was a massacre with Tenryu outweighing Orihara by what looked to be 100 pounds, but they put together a good story, and it was as good as it possibly could have been given the drawbacks. Next came Takashi Ishikawa vs Great Kabuki in a 30-minute draw. Actually, the match had some moments, stiff chair shots, stiff tackles and clotheslines. Everything was stiff. Of course, all totaled, that was probably only 2/30 of the match. The other 27/30 was so bad, like -2 3/4 stars, that whomever decided these two should go 30 before an audience of anything but their biggest enemies should have their booker's permit revoked. I know I wouldn't have wished this on my enemies. Then came another intermission before they ended the show with the Battle Royal, which Kabuki won. It wasn't good, but it was better than most US Battle Royals. Most unique show August 17th JWP television special. In your wildest dreams or most drug-induced crazed state you could never imagine something quite like this. TV Asahi, one of the 4 major networks in Japan, got this crazy idea a few months back about doing a Clash of the Champions for Insomniacs. They scheduled a live television special from 1:30 to 5 a.m. and wanted all the small groups in Japan that don't have television to combine. Well, politics and scheduling being what they are, only one group agreed to it, the new JWP, Japanese Women's Pro Wrestling. So at about 1:20 a.m., after wandering from one television studio to another in downtown Tokyo for more than a half hour, myself, John Muse and wrestler Sean Waltman, Lightning Kid, who only had an 8:30 a.m. wake-up call for a long road trip the next day, found the studio. This was after a journey that included stumbling into CNN headquarters in Japan and seeing highlights of the Republican convention, and somehow finding Antonio Inoki's office at a television network, and being detained by security speaking nothing but Japanese, well, it is their country, who were wondering what exactly we were doing wandering around an office building at 1 a.m. The studio was pretty much like any TV wrestling studio those of you who remember wrestling in the 70s in many of the territories will fondly recall, or those of you who remember Memphis wrestling from last Saturday. There were about 115 clinically insane people at the studio. They must have been, since nobody left early, although there was a rumor they were all being held at gunpoint, and an overflow of magazine reporters in the lobby down the hall watching on television, and a cast of about 9 or 10 celebrity commentators from the sports and entertainment world, including the legendary Chigusa Nagi, herself with her eyes shut and head on the table fighting to stay awake. And it was only 1:20 a.m. The show began with an introduction of the 9 women on the show, and it was time for the opener, Big Bad Devil Masami, who is like a cross between Jim Duggan, Road Warrior Animal, Ric Flair, Joni Weston and Dump Matsumoto, and still not at all unattractive 15-year veteran who dates back to the original boom era of women's wrestling with the Crush Gal. She teamed with Mayumi Ozaki, a tiny woman, against Dynamite Kansai, who those of you who recall the WCW pay-per-view show from Phoenix in 1991 will remember as Miss A, and her partner was sometimes model Cutie Suzuki. They went out there and had one hell of a 25-minute match, with topes, dives out of the ring, stiff work, brutal guardrail and chair shots, and the highlight being Masami on the floor pressing Suzuki overhead, walking around the ringside area with her, stopping in front of a half-asleep Chigusa Nagi, her rival about 7 years back, yelling at Nagio and dropping Suzuki on the table basically right in her lap. Masami has more ring savvy than any of the All Japan women, although I wouldn't go so far as to say she is one of the top 5 female workers of today. Then came 30 minutes of commercial mania. If you ever thought the delays in the clashes were bad, you never would again. The only comparison I could come up with was for the few of you who may have lived in Texas during the early 1980s and attended the Dallas Sportatorium cards during the days when they had to revive certain wrestlers in order for them to do a coherent interview. The second match didn't get in the ring until about 2:45 a.m., with a relatively normal-looking Plum Marco wrestling the Borishoy Kid, who was a teenager dressed up like Bozo the Clown. I was just glad Vince McMahon or Antonio Pena wasn't watching because they'd steal the gimmick for sure. They went about 16 minutes and it wasn't too bad. Then another singles match, with Hikari Fukuoka, who was really good, against Sumiko Saito, who has great potential, and they put on a great 20-minute match doing just about every move in the book. Finally, at about 3:50 a.m., it was time for the main event, an only give-up battle royal, which means the only way to be eliminated is via submission. This was the best battle royal I've seen since those classic Los Angeles and San Francisco battle royals of the early 1970s. Actually, it was probably better than they were too, but nobody who grew up in California would ever believe it if I said that. I think there were 4 topes. Masami did a press slam on her partner in the opener, Ozaki, and dropped her over the top rope where she took a bump on the floor. The guardrail took a major beating. At one point Masami was destroying some of the women in the grandstands. Even Chigusa was wide awake for this one. Kansai did a dive through the ropes and missed and went straight into the guardrail. Borishoy Kid did the Asai moonsault at about 4:05 a.m., the move Liger did to Chris Benoit during the last clash. Try to put yourself in my shoes for a second. It's 4:05 a.m. on a Monday night. You're in a foreign country where nobody speaks your language. You're watching this unbelievable battle royal and some woman dressed up like Bozo the Clown is doing the Asai moonsault. It was 10 minutes of mind-blowing action before anyone was eliminated. Plum Marco ended up winning in 20:05 by eliminating Fukuoka after they went back and forth for a few minutes, although that is probably the least important aspect of the show. Best men's wrestling match, Jushin Liger vs. Pegasus Kid, Chris Benoit on August 12th at Sumo Palace, by a small margin over Rick Rude vs. Masa Chono in the NWA Tournament Finals that same night. It looks like Benoit got himself a job with WCW through that match. The Liger Kid finish saw Liger standing on the top turnbuckle, as was Kid, with Liger apparently going to give Kid a double arm superplex that he used to beat Norio Oniga the previous night. He has Kid hooked for the move. Kid then grabbed Liger under the waist, picks him up like a power bomb, and at the same time jumped off the top rope. They both landed nearly in mid-ring, with Liger getting power bombed, pinned, and did a stretcher job. Who can figure? 3 days later, Kid did the job when given a shot at Al Samurai's IWGP Junior Heavyweight title. It would have been the best move of the week, except Best Hope Dive, the Great Sasuke, Universal. On August 15th at Korakuen Hall, he was on the top rope with his opponent, Super Dolphin, in the middle of the ring ready to do the big splash off the top rope. Well, that's what I thought. Instead, he shocked everyone by doing a moonsault backwards to the floor over the post and made a perfect hit on El Bucanero, who was a few rows deep in the aisle. Best one I've ever seen live. People that you may not have heard of but probably should remember: Satoshi Kojima and Hiroyoshi Yamamoto, the New Japan opening match tag team. 5 years from now they'll be Masachanos and Keiji Mutos, the Headhunters. Well, I'm sure you've heard of them. There is no word to describe these twin brothers from the Dominican Republic who are Abdullah the Butcher lookalikes other than incredible. On August 14th, at the Wing Show, they had a quadruple juice 4 1/4 stars match against Masaru Toi, a small rookie who is actually quite good and should be a great worker in time, and Iceman, Ricky Santana. Among the moves these twins, who are about 5'11" and I'd guess weigh about 375 did, were running on the apron and doing the somersault in midair and hitting Toi with a body block. Imagine if you're a 190-pound guy like Toi trying to catch an elephant like that. Then one did the Asai moonsault that Iceman moved, but his brother, who was holding Iceman, got taken out instead. Then one came off the top rope, did a somersault in midair, Iceman moved again and he flipped and landed on his back on the ringside table and broke the table. Their winning move is the Road Warrior clothesline. Later in the card, when Hunter's manager Victor Quiñones ordered his entire stable to attack Mr. Pogo, who is in the process of turning babyface after being fired by Quiñones after losing the fire death match to Mitsuhiro Matsunaga on August 2nd, one with 5 guys holding Pogo on the mat. The Hunter did a perfect moonsault Kanekobashi style on Pogo, who did a stretcher job. Great Sasuke is mentioned earlier, who Universal is trying to push as the new babyface star, even to the point of having him use Yoshihiro Asai's entrance music. Asai was the group's top draw before joining SWS, and he obviously is no Asai, but does some incredible moves already and some of the best hopes around. Most of you are probably familiar as well with Lightning Kid and Jerry Lynn from matches against each other on Global, but they're actually better as a team because they've created some unique tag team moves. Pantrita Del Ring, a wrestling legend from Monterrey who just a few weeks back began appearing on AAA shows, was the most impressive of the Mexican wrestlers on this Universal tour with the exception of Gran Hamada. Hamada is perhaps the most underrated worker in the world today. He's 42 years old and I don't think there's a wrestler in the US that's as good as he is. And last, a Soviet wrestler named Volkan, who works for Rings and according to fan balloting in Weekly Pro Wrestling, is currently the 3rd most popular foreign wrestler in Japan, trailing only Stan Hansen and Gary Albright. Han, legitimate champion in Soviet Commando Samba Wrestling, real submission-style wrestling, was put over Akira Maeda 2 months back and will surely draw a huge house for his return match with him down the road. Han has no chest, rather thin arms, and in fact, no physique at all, maybe 6'3", 220 pounds, and obviously has almost no working experience, yet he is so convincing with his submissions and has an uncanny sense of drama and timing that seem impossible for someone with just 4 or 5 matches under their belt to have. Biggest change, the audience at All Japan Women shows. The All Japan Women's group years back used to draw an audience that was close to 90% teenage girls. I recall in 1987, the first time I saw the group live, that the work rate was exceptional, but the audience was there for Chigusa Mania, as the building was filled with young girls dressed like Chigusa Nagio with haircuts like Chigusa Nagio and screamed and cried like crazy when Chigusa Nagio was being brutalized by Dump Matsumoto. No hardcore wrestling fan would have been caught dead in the building, even though it actually had the best hardcore action of any of the promotions. Women's wrestling was culturally stigmatized as simply something for teenage girls. It's a new era with all new stars today, and a totally different audience. The last time I saw the women at Korakuen in March of 1991, the audience was split almost 50-50 between the teenage girls of before and the hardcore wrestling fans who got into the group because of the charisma of Asia Kong and the realization and appreciation of just how good the matches and wrestlers really were. On August 15th, I guess the pendulum has almost completely swung, as the crowd being close to 90% hardcore male wrestling fans. As a unique atmosphere, it no longer exists. There is little of the crying, although there was some but the few remaining teenage girls, at the emotional climaxes, less of the streamer throwing, and on the financial downside, the hardcore fans aren't going to buy nearly the amount of gimmicks that the teenage girl audience did. However, Korakuen was overflowed with about 2,300 fans in a building that seats 1,860, and the belief, probably true, is this group of hardcore fans will be more loyal. Unlike in the US, pro wrestling draws a very distinct audience in Japan, largely male to a much greater extent than in the US, almost all between the ages of 15 and their early 30s, apparently affluent, because of the ticket prices, although I'm sure that isn't the case totally, but surely far more than in the US. The wing and FMW type groups with a heavy emphasis on blood draw what comes off as a lower rent audience, so to speak, than the other groups, and definitely come off as less wrestling sophisticated and have some similarities to a Memphis-style US audience, although nowhere near that far. The WWF-style crowd, with all the 5 to 11-year-olds, doesn't exist for any group, which is one aspect of US wrestling that Japan can learn from. New Japan had that audience in the early 1980s during the heyday of Tiger Mask but lost it. But with sellouts at all the major show, New Japan isn't as apt to change its course, nor should it. Nearly everyone that comes to the buildings, unlike in the US, knows their wrestling. Everyone seemingly brings the latest weekly magazines to the building with them, and they're studying the news before the show starts. Subtle moves often get over more than outrageous moves. Over-exaggerated bumps that US heels specialize on usually result in audience apathy. Another change, very noticeable even over the past 18 months, is that more of the Japanese wrestlers than ever before are on the juice. They don't have the ultimate warrior physiques, probably due to both some genetic differences and probably more to different training and a different diet, but there is no doubt many of the younger wrestlers have emulated the American stars that have been imported. Quite frankly, even a lot of the veterans seem bigger and thicker and more muscular than they were in their prime, which shows the juice is not just limited to the new generation. What can we learn from the success of pro wrestling in Japan that is adaptable to the United States? First off, the most important difference is that no promotion in Japan ever insults its audience's intelligence. They don't stray from the course to the point they alienate their core audience. Thus, they don't have nearly the business peaks and valleys, and of late, mainly valleys, of their American counterparts. Whatever showmanship and gimmicks that are being used are confined to where it doesn't upstage the contest itself, rather than the contest being the backdrop for the gimmicks. This may sound overly simplistic, but quite frankly, I think the best booking is the simplest and most direct. I don't believe overbooking or hot-shotting is conducive to long-term business health. Whenever I see the way the two different businesses have gone in different directions, and which one stays healthy and which one is constantly in need of medical supervision, I become more convinced that overbooking has damaged the business in this country to a great extent. I'm not talking about almost non-booking like All Japan, which simply sells itself by having great matches, and largely the same matches, over and over again, but like New Japan, which has personalities, characters, heated angles, changing matchups and feuds, and great action from the opening match to the main event, and every major card isn't like going to a bunch of wrestling match but like going to a festival of wrestling. Several other groups in Japan have similar atmospheres. Nevertheless, the storylines are conducive to the action, but the key thing is still the matches and who wins and who loses, with almost exclusively clean finishes, and not cheap storylines being used to try and avoid having real finishes, which ultimately lead to television viewer and arena goer apathy. New Japan's mix is probably more applicable to US than All Japan because New Japan does clean finishes probably 95% of the time, but when they do American screw jobs, they are so infrequent that they work. The 100% clean finishes of All Japan are a more conservative approach that I won't knock because of just how consistently successful it is, but I hardly think the rare screw job when almost all finishes are clean is going to alienate anyone. This trip has made me an even bigger believer in clean finishes and less exaggerated cartoonish heel, and sometimes face, characters to make things seem less preposterous and increase credibility. Not credibility within the general public, because that's never going to happen, but credibility within the potentially huge audience of wrestling fans when fans are allowed to believe by not having their intelligences insulted by what the promoters are serving. When All Japan used to end all their big matches with screw job finishes so none of the top boys ever had to do a job because of the belief they were protecting them when over the long haul they were doing nothing of the kind. You could buy a ringside ticket to Korakuen Hall at noon on the day of the show. Since they instituted the policy of having clean winners and losers in every match with no ref bumps, outside interference, etc., well, the August 22nd show at Budokan marked the 96th consecutive sellout for All Japan in Tokyo, and getting into Korakuen on All Japan nights is pretty much next to impossible if you aren't already a regular. The October 21st show at Budokan Hall is already sold out. Tickets sold out the first day they were put on sale again, and no lineup has even been announced. The talent today in the promotion is no better than it was in 1984. Introducing and having different submission maneuvers beat top guys has added tons to the intensity of matches, even more than the spectacular high spots that needn't be done away with, but also incorporated as part of the complete package. The heat when Toshiaki Kawada put Danny Spivey in a simple facelock and Spivey made it to the ropes was more than I've seen in any US move in years. Why? The facelock has been used to gain submissions on Jumbo, who the fans believe is the toughest guy in the promotion. Indeed, eventually, Kawada made Spivey submit to the facelock, And it was the most heated finishing sequence of the card. Chalk up a ton of more heat for the simple move. The most heat on the 3 New Japan cards was when Chono caught Muto in the STF. And Muto, as much of a superstar that he is, submitted. Of course, Terry Gordy uses the same STF in the US and nobody reacts. But if for 2 years, he makes all the top faces submit at one time or another with it, they'll react like mad when he gets it on, or when the face breaks it by getting to the ropes. Will it kill the faces? It sure doesn't seem to have in Japan. The other hardcore wrestling fans, given time to be exposed to the product, and keep in mind, this will take years to accomplish but ultimately would be successful, will accept women's wrestling provided the women are better than the men. If they aren't as good, or even aren't just as good, people aren't going to buy it for anything more than a very short period as a Tanda show because all things being equal, our society will always treat men's athletics as superior to women except in the few sports, gymnastics and figure skating comes to mind, where women have the physical ability to outshine men in. If they are better, they'll be respected for it and eventually they'll have an audience because wrestling is probably the only contact sport exhibition entertainment whatever at which women at the top level because they have greater flexibility, or lighter and thus have more endurance, can outperform men in. That's it for this issue. We will be back after a quick battery charge.